So how in the world does a tense military standoff in the Middle East connect with a mysterious weapon that was just bought on the open market? Today we're going to break down a report that ties these two things together, showing how modern conflict is being fought on some very, very different fronts.
It really doesn't get much more direct than this. This was the blunt message Iranian state media sent right to the U.S. president. Talk about drawing a line in the sand. It's clear, it's simple, and it's an incredibly dangerous declaration that really sets the stage for what could happen next.
So what kicked all this off? Well, the whole situation really ignited when the U.S. president started looking at military options against Iran. This was in direct response to the regime's brutal crackdown on anti-government protesters. And of course, the whole world was holding its breath to see what would happen.
And the U.S. didn't just talk, it started to act. Military assets began moving back toward the Middle East. But here's the thing, this wasn't just some simple show of force. It was actually a really sharp, sudden reversal, because it came right after a recent withdrawal of naval power from the region. So this was a huge signal that the whole game had changed, like overnight.
So that brings up a really big question. If things escalated from threats to actual action, was the U.S. military even ready to strike? Well, this report gives a surprisingly frank look at the American military posture at that exact moment.
And the answer? Well, it was basically no. Apparently, the president wanted to be sure that any military action would be fast, decisive, and, this is the key part, wouldn't spiral into a bigger war. But according to the source, the military just couldn't give that guarantee. They just weren't positioned for that kind of clean, overwhelming strike.
And this table, wow, it really paints a picture. Just look at these numbers. Only 6 U.S. warships in the entire Middle East. And that's just 3 destroyers and 3 smaller combat ships. Now compare that to the 12 warships that were parked in the Caribbean near Venezuela at the very same time. The firepower was clearly focused somewhere else entirely.
And just think about this. For the first time in years, the ultimate symbol of American power, an aircraft carrier, was completely absent from the region. That's like the biggest tool in the toolbox, right? And it was just gone. The Pentagon had actually ordered the USS Ford to the Caribbean. And on top of that, some anti-missile batteries had also been pulled out. The U.S. presence was definitely thinned out.
But hold on, don't mistake a reduced presence for a lack of power. Because despite those withdrawals, the U.S. still had an incredible amount of firepower just lurking under the surface. An Ohio-class submarine, which can fire up to 154 Tomahawk missiles, was still in the area. That is a mind-boggling amount of force from just one single unseen platform.
So you've got this really complex military picture, right? Some key assets are gone, but you've got this incredible hidden power still there. So given all that, what were the actual options on the table for the president? What could he do?
Okay, so the military options were all about being targeted and strategic. Experts were suggesting strikes that could focus on taking out Iran's missile capabilities, hitting their production and storage sites. Or they could target the regime's economic lifeline, its oil refineries. And then there was the most direct option, going after the leaders themselves.
And here is where things get really 21st century. This is some real modern warfare stuff. One expert pointed to Israel's tactics, describing this fascinating strategy. You use cyber attacks to mess with communications, which forces the enemy's leaders to all gather in one place. And then, boom, you've got a single, high-value target for a physical strike. A very, very modern way to cut the head off the snake.
But it wasn't all about bombs and missiles. The U.S. was also turning the screws in other ways. The State Department announced new sanctions, targeting key parts of the Iranian regime's infrastructure, including a pretty notorious prison and what they called a shadow banking network that was being used to launder oil money.
Okay, so while all of this is playing out in the open, the military moves, the economic pressure, the very same report shifts gears to something much, much stranger. A more clandestine kind of conflict. It's a mystery that has baffled U.S. intelligence for years, and the first real clue might have just been bought on the open market.
Yeah, we're talking about Havana Syndrome. You've probably heard of it. That's the name for all these bizarre, unexplained medical incidents that have been happening to U.S. diplomats and spies. And this source reveals a pretty startling new development. A weapon was purchased that might finally give us some answers.
So what is this thing? It's called a pulse energy weapon. And get this, the Department of Homeland Security didn't seize it in some secret raid, they simply bought one on the open market. Now the Pentagon has it, and they are actively testing it to see if this is the kind of tech that could have caused the serious brain injuries reported by hundreds of U.S. personnel.
This whole story is developing so fast. First off, just the fact that this kind of weapon was commercially available that's wild in itself. Second, it's now the prime suspect for these awful symptoms, headaches, memory loss, vertigo, that have plagued U.S. officials for years. And third, the victims themselves have suspected for a long time that a foreign adversary was behind this, and many feel like the U.S. government has been covering it up. Now Congress is finally stepping in, with House Republicans launching a formal investigation.
So we've basically seen two very different faces of modern conflict here. You have the visible, state-on-state threats, like between the US and Iran, and then you have this invisible, deniable harm caused by a weapon you can apparently just go out and buy. It really raises a critical question for all of us. Which is the greater threat? The aircraft carrier you can see coming from a mile away, or the weapon you can't see at all?